you.
So we will move now to the second speaker. The first part also of this conference about education to conservation. So today we have Miss Wing Chi, so a conservation officer from the Agriculture, Fisheries and Conservation Department. So she's working mainly on coordinating and conducting surveys, especially on mammals, and she's working to improve the biodiversity conservation and specifically bats conservation. So today, that's why she will give an overview of the biodiversity that we can encounter here in Hong Kong. So it will link with our keynote speaker to show what we have to develop and protect through sustainable development. So Wing Chi, when you feel ready to share your PowerPoint. You're still muted. Yeah, I think it's okay now.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for joining today.
No problem. Let me see if this works.
Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my computer is really slow, so it's loading. Okay. Is it the full screen now that you're looking?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Wing, and I'm quite happy to be here today to be able to speak about something I'm really passionate about, which is the local biodiversity. And I will also have especially talk a bit about bats and the work we have done so far. So let's start. So this is the photo that I often like to show to people about Hong Kong, as this is a very, very typical image and impression of what people usually have of Hong Kong. However, many people may not be aware that this is also Hong Kong. So some would argue that, okay, maybe when I'm out in the wild and when I see, when I'm in the country park, maybe I come across with biodiversity. But otherwise, if I live in the city center and isn't Hong Kong still just a concrete jungle? And what kind of biodiversity can we have here? So while it might seem to be true that when you just look at a photo like this, which is Quarry Bay, a very typical residential area in Hong Kong, there is actually, if you look close enough, there are actually quite a lot of wildlife around. It's not difficult actually for us if you look up to spot a black kite above our head. And it's also quite easy to come across a palette squirrel running around on the tree. Also, I'm sure every one of you have seen this little bird standing on wire, which is the Eurasian tree sparrow. And also, in fact, if you look close enough, you can just see there are so many creatures hiding around the corner. Our biodiversity doesn't just end with the day. As night approaches, frogs and newts start to come out on the fringe of the city. And even if you don't see wildlife around, you might possibly hear them calling from a distance, including the collared scops owl and the barking deer. Despite the small size of Hong Kong, which is just about 1,100 square kilometers, and with the rapid urbanization, actually, in fact, about 70% of our land are green area. And over 40% of our land cover is protected as country parks and as special area or restricted area. The unique combination of the subtropical climate and geographical location of Hong Kong has given us actually a very unique environment for a great variety of marine and terrestrial habitats that provide homes to many of our wildlife. So these are some figures of our local biodiversity. You can see that there are many different kinds of animals and plants can be found in Hong Kong. And taking birds as an example, although Hong Kong is a tiny, tiny city compared to the whole of China, due to the diverse habitats and the location of being right on the major global flyway, in fact, over 35% of the bird species recorded in Hong Kong can be found here. In addition to having rich biodiversity, Hong Kong is also a stronghold for some globally threatened species like the Chinese pangolin and the black-faced spoonbill. There are also species that are only recorded in Hong Kong, or the majority of its global population fall within Hong Kong, just like the Roman's tree frog. Due to their rarity, these species are actually of very high conservation importance, both locally and globally. And from here, I would like to narrow down my topic to focus on the most exciting group of animals under mammals. There are currently 55 species of terrestrial mammals existing in Hong Kong, and among them, almost half of them are bats. And this is how they look. So out of the 25 species of bats in Hong Kong, actually 2 of them are fruit bats. They can be easily distinguished by their big eyes and their puppy-looking face. The rest of the bats are insectivorous and they feed on insects. They're generally smaller in size and also compared to the fruit bats, and they have smaller eyes but bigger ears for receiving echolocation calls. On top of the insects, some insectivorous bats also consume other prey, like this Rickett's big-footed Myotes. It has big and strong claws that are known to be able to snatch fish off the water surface. So now let me introduce a few of our bat representatives in Hong Kong. This is the Himalayan leafnose bat. It is the biggest bat species in Hong Kong in terms of weight. It has a very typical characteristics of an insectivorous bat, small eyes and big ears. It also has a very distinctive nose, which is kind of like wrinkly and leafy shape. And this special nose shape is actually not for ornamental purpose, but more for actually modifying and directing calls produced and emitted from the larynx. This bat likes to roost in anthropogenic structure, like water tunnels or inside caves or in houses. And they also like to roost and gather in great numbers. It's actually not uncommon to come across a group of over 1,000 of these bats in one group. And I think the largest number I ever encountered was about 2,500 of them. And they also have displayed actually quite an interesting seasonal migrating movement pattern, is that they usually like to stay, some of them like to stay in old village houses like the top photo. And when weather gets colder, more or less around November, they like to move and live inside the water tunnels and caves. So you can actually see a seasonal movement of these bats. Now, moving on to our next candidate is the lesser bamboo bats. This ginger hair fellow is actually the smallest bats in Hong Kong, and with the size of just about half of your thumb, which is weighing around 5 grams. As suggested by its name, the bamboo bats like to roost inside the bamboo, which are very common in the rural areas and country parks. Being very small and has a flat skull, the bat is very adapted to living inside bamboo and moving in and out through the tiny slit, like this. They're really small. You can see the scale in the photo. And then it being so flat, it can actually make use of very small slit in the bamboo and go in and out and use bamboo as their home. And then, okay. And they also have, the body is also adapted to living inside the bamboo by having actually fleshy pads on the thumb, at the base of the thumb and the sole of the hind feet. So they can have better gripping when they are inside the bamboo. And lastly, this is the short-nosed fruit bat. And I said before, the fruit bat is characterized by bigger eyes and a puppy face. Hence, actually another name of this bat is also called the dog-faced fruit bat. It feeds on a wide variety of fruits, both wild and cultivated, such as figs, lychee, bananas, or mangoes. It also like nectar, so we actually have seen the bats actually flying and hovering around flowers in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, these bats actually love to roost under the Chinese fan palms, which is a very common species you see in the country parks or around the sitting out area. And then what they do is they can also have a special talent of building a tent using the palm trees. What they do is they will bite away bits from the palm fronds, palm leaves, so that they will collapse into a shape of a tent, which they will take shelter under. And now, next, I would like to share about some interesting facts about bats and why they're the most fascinating animals on the planet. First of all, there are over 1,400 species of bats in the world, and they all look really, really different. So from the really sweet looking one you can see here, they can also, some of them can also look very peculiar, or even some might call very weird. And some of them also could look very comical. So bats are in fact distributed all over the world in all the continents except Antarctica. Secondly, bats are the only true flying mammals. Some would argue, well, I've seen flying squirrel and flying lemur on the documentaries, but these animals can actually not fly, but they can only do gliding. So actually bats are the only species that are able to fly. Bats' wings are actually hands, like human hands, that have been adapted for flight, which means they're very, very flexible and they can move independently. It makes them also a very agile flyer, and that they're able to maneuver in very complex environments like the woodlands. Besides being agile, actually some bat species are indeed very strong flyers, and they can travel long distances. The longest distance record was actually set by a little pipistrelle that was found traveling from northeast to southwest of Europe in a single journey for flying over 2,200 kilometers. And then even if some of you have not seen a bat before, one thing you will surely know is that bat hangs upside down. They don't do that for fun, but for some real advantages of being upside down. And usually they like to hang around somewhere high above ground. One of the advantages of being high up is that they can avoid predators like cats and snakes. And there are also less disturbance and more peace and quiet when they're up there alone. And the most important reason for bats liking to hang upside down is because, for real practical reason, is because this will help them fly, which makes them, they can simply take off and start flapping when they let go of their feet. These special habits also make them good dancers when we flip them over like this. Another amazing thing about bats is that they're exceptionally long-lived for the size. So usually life expectancy is proportionate to the body size, which means when you are bigger, the bigger you are, the longer you live. So if I take mouse as an example, which is also a smaller mammal, they usually live around a year or two at most in the wild. But for bats, which are usually much smaller than mice, they actually could live more, usually can live over 10 years in the wild. And right now there are at least 6 species that we know that they can live for over 30 years. And the longest living bats we have is this Brandt's Myotes, which has been recorded, like you said, yeah, recorded with a record of over 41 years old. Lastly, most bats use echolocation to navigate and locate their prey, which means they rely very much on their ears relies more on their ears than their eyes to see. And because of that, across the world, bats have evolved into having amazingly diverse facial morphologies that allow them to maximize the reception of echolocation calls. So then you may think, okay, bats are cool and maybe a little bit fascinating, but why should we care about them? Not only because bats are extremely fascinating, they also play important roles in our ecosystem and the economy as pollinator, seed disperser, fertilizers, and even pest control. So for example, one tiny small pipistrelle can actually eat hundreds of bugs per night, if not thousands. Also, a lot of fruits you see in this photo will not have existed or produced in this amount if bats are not around. And you'd probably be scratching right now as you listen to this talk if there are not bats around to feed the mosquitoes. So in short, without bats, the world could go upside down and become a very much less livable place. So now let's move back to Hong Kong and look at the bat work we have carried out so far. Bats in Hong Kong were officially documented starting 1950s, and there have been a graduate discovery of bats throughout the last decades. In order to learn more about bats and their status in Hong Kong, my team has started studying and surveying bats since 2002. And then the major surveys we do are cave census, which include winter and summer roost counts in places like water tunnels, abandoned mines, and sea caves. We also do mist netting sometimes. However, doing mist netting in Hong Kong is not an easy task compared to places like in Southeast Asia, which is very possible for us to go through nights without catching any bats. We also would do trap survey and acoustic recordings when suitable. So these are some examples of survey locations for cave census, which are different kinds of water tunnels, different kinds of caves. And then the one in the right in the middle the one in the middle second row photo is actually a drainage pipe that we actually have to bend down our whole body throughout the whole survey in order to get through the drain. Besides surveying cave structures, we also survey the wetlands, which is an important foraging ground for bats. We will also sometimes visit rural areas, and especially to check on some old village houses to see that which may be inhabited by the Himalayan leafnose bats. And because our team cannot always survey over all the sites, and there might be changes with the bat distribution. So in case you happen to come across bat roosts in village houses like this, you're very welcome to share your sighting with us and let me know, and email it to this address with the location and preferably a photo, so we can keep record of their whereabouts. Besides, we also survey the woodlands to look for forest species, such as checking on bamboos and to see if there is any sign of bat usage. This is an image of two bamboo bats that we actually captured when we found a slit on a bamboo stem in our survey, and we actually slid in an endoscope and to look for what is inside, and then we found two bats in there. So what we do is we're also currently trying to record features of the bamboo species and seeking advice from our botanists in the department to try to identify bamboo species that have been seen with the presence of bats in the hope of better understanding their habitat preference. So based on our survey results and observations, we actually can summarize bats very crudely into three kinds. One is the cave species, which they make use and they like to stay inside the roost, like water tunnel, caves, or even an underground basement area. Another group is the forest species, like the bamboo bats I just talked about. And there are also many bats that make use of tree hollows and crevices to roost, like the nocturnal bats. So for the forest species, we can find them right inside the woodlands, and it's also common to encounter them at the fringe of the rural areas, which there are a lot of vegetation planted. And then lastly, we had this urban dwellers, which is quite specific to Hong Kong, such as this Japanese pipistrelle. These bats are very adapted to the urban environment, and they can easily find roosts between walls and cracks and hide inside buildings. So, and there are also like urban parks situated right in the city centers, which provide really good resting and foraging grounds for these bats to roost. Having said that, the three kinds of classification is a very crude one, and it's actually possible for some bats to have two identities, such as a cave bat could possibly also be an urban dweller. Next, we also have done other, besides regular monitoring, we also have some special projects that I can share a couple here. One of them is the bat box surveys, which we go around, which we place some bat boxes in areas like the wetlands to not only provide alternative roosting sites for the bats, but also we want to see, conduct trials to see whether these boxes and what kind of bat boxes or box types are favored by our local bats. So far from our experiments, we found out that the most common residents we get in the current bat boxes are the Japanese pipistrelle, and occasionally we also will get the lesser yellow bats, which is otherwise quite rarely recorded. We also have the short-nosed fruit bat project we also have the short-nosed fruitbat project at the urban parks. This is an irregular project which we normally do with our summer interns and usually lasts for about 2 months. The first one we did started in 2004. And then what we do is we just survey major urban parks in Hong Kong and to look for the roosting characteristics and patterns of short-nosed fruit bats and try to understand the usage of the urban parks. There was an article that was written up a long time ago about this project and with some findings, and we have published it on our newsletter in 2006. So if you're interested, you can scan this QR code and read the article. And then, okay, coming to the last part of my talk, I would like to talk about challenges and opportunities. Like most wildlife in an urbanized place, bats in Hong Kong are actually facing a lot of challenges with habitat degradation and human disturbance, such as water pollution, light pollution. There are also many, many things that we know very little about bats, including some understudied species and understudied areas. There's also climate change that is potentially affecting food source and animal behavior. Resources and fundings is always a problem, and bat conservation is not always the first thing people have in mind, even when money comes in. But to me, the biggest among all the challenges, the biggest challenge that we face is actually the public perception of bats. Bats have historically and typically been painted in a negative light, and it's actually very difficult to find a scary, eerie photo without having bats in the background. So bats have always been portrayed as evil, linked with evil spirits. They're the carrier of disease. And despite bats are doing actually a lot of good to us, it gets a lot of bad press, and there are a lot of misconceptions about them. And which unfortunately, these have been reinforced by the media and social media. And Hong Kong having the very unique setting of having nature right next to the city center also created a lot of human-wildlife conflicts. And then this is especially problems for species that are very well adapted to the urban environment. And obviously having disease outbreaks like the COVID or the SARS doesn't help, and it reinforces people's fear for bats. It may all sound very, very depressing. However, it doesn't mean that we can do nothing about it. We realize that it's actually important to acknowledge the challenges and look forward for opportunities. From our past surveys, we have identified species that are less common, or species that we realize we have little knowledge of, that we decided that we would be putting more resources in filling these information gaps, such as we have started working with overseas museums on bat taxonomy right now, and hopefully to answer some questions. And also, in order to provide a more livable place for bats, there are many more things that we can do based on our previous work done and also experience accumulated, including enhancing their habitats and maybe working on the best practices for bat conservation. Lastly, we also realize that it's actually important to work on, it's very important to work on the human perception of bats and let people know that the importance of bats to the ecosystem and to us. And hopefully that we can find ways to change people's attitudes and change people's behavior. I think this is exactly what Sonia is talking about, how important education is in order to bring about change. And in fact, back in the traditional Chinese culture, bat symbolizes good fortune and luck. So it's really, really up to us whether we want to see bats as this or this. So that's all about bats. And if you guys are interested about knowing more about biodiversity, I would like to share two websites that is managed by my team. One is the Facebook page that shares a lot of information about biodiversity. Unfortunately, I think most of it is in Chinese. And then the second one, there's the Biodiversity Information Hub, which is a new website that was just just launched in March with a lot of information on Hong Kong species and habitat. So you can scan the QR codes and visit this site if you want to learn more about biodiversity. So I think that's it. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Wing, for your presentation. And working also on bats is refreshing to see other people promoting that bats are not only monsters that drink blood, but also a huge pollinizer and environmental actors for all the fruits and agricultures. So if you mind, I will ask you different questions that we received. So
okay.
People see bats like reservoir of zoonotic disease, and how Hong Kong government is dealing with this paradox of bats conservation and at the same time maybe spreading disease, like you said, with now the situation with COVID.
It's really, really difficult because, like I said, having the media and also actually the facts that it is actually true that bats do carry disease like and viruses like other animals. What we try to do is to tell the public, to let them know that it's normal for animals to be carrying viruses and bacteria because they're wildlife, they're animals, and even humans also have a lot of viruses. But we also reassure them actually if we keep a very respectable distance from the species, which they are actually fine and happy in their own roosting sites, if we keep a respectable distances, there wouldn't be we don't actually have to worry about catching any disease or bringing about any outbreaks. So I think it's almost about having the right attitude and behavior towards the animals, that you know what kind of thinking you have with them. And conserving bats, given bats have so many benefits, that it's not because there are some disease outbreaks and we decided we need to get rid of the bats, but instead we need to find ways that we can coexist with them while both species groups are in the safe place.
Yes, yeah, so it's not because we promote conservation that we are as well, we don't need to hug all the animals that we protect, we just respect the environment. So we have a second question, maybe the last one, because we are a bit out of time. So how has the number of bats varied in Hong Kong over the past few years? And I guess I can combine with the question if there is any endemic bat species here.
Sorry, I couldn't quite catch it. Do you mind?
Sorry. So yeah, the question, so it was two questions in one, like there is any endemic species of bats in Hong Kong, and the different population of bats, how they vary during those last years in Hong Kong.
You mean how it, I still
the population of bats, how they grow or reduce, what are the...
Okay, about different species. So yeah. It's actually not easy to sort, not for all species. So for some species that we do regular root census, we have a better idea how the distribution and the numbers are, because we do visit them annually and check on the numbers to have the idea of whether they are rising, stable, or dropping. So generally speaking, we do actually think those cave species are quite stable, because I think water tunnels and some of the cave systems, the habitat has been quite stable and relatively not as much disturbed as other places. So for cave species, we have the impression that it's actually quite, the population was doing okay. And then, but we do actually have to admit there are some species, especially forest species, or species that have very restricted distribution, that we have less information of. Those, we still see them, we still record them from time to time in our acoustic surveys, but because our surveys have not been, the way we designed the survey does not allow to make a very conclusive conclusion about how they are right now. So actually this is exactly one of the focus we want to do right now, is to switch to doing more systematic acoustic monitoring. So we have a better idea to at least know about the level of activities and also the occurrence and distribution throughout times. So.
Thank you for your answer. So thank you yet to joining. Sorry to not ask all the questions. We are running out of time.